Some people are born to follow the rules. They walk a straight, meticulously paved path, live their lives within the lines drawn by society, and leave behind a neat, tidy, and often predictable legacy. Their stories are written in stone. And then there are people like Edwina Mountbatten, people whose stories are written in fire. On the surface, she was the absolute epitome of aristocratic perfection. She was one of the greatest heiresses in England, a celebrated beauty whose marriage was a fairy tale union of immense new money and ancient royal blood. She was Lady Louis Mountbatten, the wife of a dashing naval hero with a direct line to the throne. She would become the Countess Mountbatten of Burma, the last Vicereine of India, a confidant of queens, kings, and prime ministers, a figure of almost supernatural style, grace, and influence. She was, in every visible sense, a royal swan, gliding with an effortless, almost imperious elegance across the glittering, sun-dappled surface of high society. But that was the performance. That was the role she was born to play. The truth was infinitely more complex, more turbulent, and more human. What if I told you that the serene swan had a wild, restless heart, a heart that could not be tamed by convention or contained by even the most gilded of cages, that beneath the flawless diamonds and the impeccable diplomacy was a woman of voracious, almost insatiable appetites for love, for adventure, for danger, and ultimately for meaning that her privileged world could not provide. The writer Truman Capote, a master of observing the beautiful and the damned, once remarked of a similar socialite, "She was a royal swan, but she swam in many lakes at once." That was the absolute essence of Edwina. Her life was never a straight path. It was a complex and often scandalous web of passions, a breathtaking story of power, privilege, and a profound, often painful personal transformation. Today we are going to look beyond the pristine, placid image of the Countess. We are going to explore the many lakes she swam in, lakes that were by turns glamorous, forbidden, and heartbreakingly tragic. We will journey from the decadent, champagne-fueled parties of the Jazz Age to the bloody, cholera-ridden refugee camps of post-war India. We will uncover the story of a woman who was at once a pillar of the British establishment and its greatest internal rebel, a woman who seemed to break every rule of her class, and in doing so, found her own remarkable world-altering purpose. This is the story of Edwina Mountbatten, and it's a story of how a restless heart didn't just chart its own course, but helped to change the course of history itself. To understand the rebellion, you have to understand the sheer, overwhelming weight of the world Edwina was born to command. She arrived in the world as Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley on the 28th of November, 1901. It was the twilight of the Edwardian era, a brief, glittering Indian summer between the long, staid reign of Queen Victoria and the coming cataclysm of the First World War. It was a world of immense, almost unimaginable wealth concentrated in the hands of a tiny few, a society where the aristocracy still held unquestioned sway, and the British Empire, a vast swathe of pink on the world map, was considered a permanent, God-given fact of life. It was a world of breathtaking privilege, but also one of stifling, suffocating expectations, especially for a woman. For a woman of the upper classes, life was a gilded cage, its bars made of etiquette, duty, and the absolute necessity of maintaining appearances. Edwina was, by birthright, a princess of this world. Her inheritance was not just vast, it was legendary. It flowed from a single extraordinary source, her maternal grandfather, Sir Ernest Cassell. To understand Edwina, you must first understand this man, for his shadow loomed over every aspect of her life. Sir Ernest was not a product of the British aristocracy. He was the architect of his own colossal fortune, a man who embodied the dynamic global capitalism that was beginning to challenge the old order of inherited land and titles. Born in Prussia in 1852 to a humble Jewish family, he arrived in England as a teenage clerk with little more than a suitcase and a brilliant mind for figures. Through a combination of daring, genius, and an almost supernatural ability to foresee market trends, he rose to become a financier of immense power, a tycoon with interests in everything from railways in Mexico to dams in Egypt. He was not just rich, he was a kingmaker, a confidant of titans and monarchs, and his closest friend, his most important client and his constant companion, was the King of England himself, Edward VII. Theirs was a deeply symbiotic relationship. The king, a man of enormous appetites and often precarious personal finances, relied on Cassell's genius to manage his affairs. Cassell in turn gained from this friendship the one thing his immense wealth alone could not buy: access to the absolute pinnacle of society and a veneer of establishment respectability. This relationship placed the family at the very heart of royal power and global finance, and it was this world of almost unimaginable opulence that Edwina was born into. She did not grow up in a mere house, she grew up in palaces. The family's London seat was Brooke House, a vast Italianate mansion on Park Lane, which Sir Ernest had filled with priceless art, tapestries, and furniture. Its most famous feature was a grand, sweeping staircase, constructed not from marble-clad stone, but from solid blocks of flawless white marble, a statement of wealth so extravagant it bordered on the fantastical. Summer holidays were spent at the Moulton Paddocks, a sprawling country estate and stud farm in Newmarket, the heart of the horse racing world. There was also a seaside villa, Branksome Dean, for coastal retreats. This was a childhood of almost absurd luxury, but it was also one of profound emotional vacancy. Edwina's father was Wilfred Ashley, a handsome and amiable, if somewhat conventional, conservative politician from an old, established aristocratic family. His marriage to Sir Ernest's only child, Maud, was a classic societal transaction of the era, the union of an ancient but modestly endowed title with a colossal and very new fortune. Edwina's mother, Maud, was a gentle, beautiful, but frail woman, a society hostess who seemed to float through life in a delicate, ethereal haze. The marriage was not a happy one. Maud was often unwell, and Wilfred was frequently absorbed in his political career. The emotional heart of the household was not a warm, familial hearth, but the cool, transactional world of their grandfather. The children, Edwina and her younger sister Mary, were raised in the customary manner of the aristocracy, at a distance. Their lives were run by a strict regime of nannies, governesses, and tutors. Their parents were remote figures, to be visited for a brief, formal period each day before being whisked back to the nursery. Love and affection were not commodities that were freely traded at Brooke House. Then tragedy struck, deepening the emotional chill of Edwina's childhood. Her mother, Maud, had long suffered from ill health. She was diagnosed with tuberculosis, the great white plague of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1911, when Edwina was just 9 years old, her mother died. The loss was profound, and it created a void in Edwina's life that would never truly be filled. She was now a motherless child, adrift in a world of immense wealth but emotional poverty, raised by a distant father and a doting but overpowering grandfather. This early experience of loss and abandonment arguably shaped the rest of her life, fueling a lifelong desperate search for the deep, unconditional love and emotional connection she had been denied as a child. Sir Ernest, now a widower himself, poured all his frustrated affection onto his two granddaughters, particularly his favorite, the bright, willful Edwina. He spoiled her outrageously, lavishing her with jewels, ponies, and couture dresses from Paris. But his love was possessive and controlling. He was determined to mold her into the perfect heiress, a woman who could preside over his vast fortune and make a marriage that would cement the family's social standing for generations. Her education was meticulously planned to achieve this end. She was taught at home by governesses, then sent to a series of exclusive and very expensive finishing schools. First the Links in Eastbourne, then Alda House in Suffolk. The curriculum was designed to polish, not to provoke. She learned fluent French and German, how to manage the vast household she would one day inherit, how to arrange flowers, and how to make sparkling, witty, but ultimately safe conversation. The goal was not to create an independent thinker, but a perfect society wife, an ornament to a powerful man's arm. But they had underestimated their pupil. Beneath the beautifully dressed, impeccably mannered exterior, Edwina possessed a razor-sharp intelligence, a fierce curiosity about the world, and a burgeoning rebellious streak. She was a voracious reader, devouring books far beyond her prescribed syllabus. She was headstrong and argued with her tutors. She was bored by the gilded cage, however luxurious its appointments. There are stories of her, as a teenager during the First World War, running away from her finishing school to try and volunteer as a nurse, only to be caught and ignominiously returned. The Swan was already beating its wings against the bars. The Great War itself was a tremor that shook the foundations of her world. It swept away the old Edwardian order and decimated a generation of young men, the very men she would have been expected to marry. It also provided her with her first taste of meaningful work. Against her family's wishes, she managed to get a job as a VAD, a voluntary aid detachment nurse, working at a hospital for wounded officers that had been set up in her own family's home, Brooke House. It was her first exposure to a world beyond the ballroom, her first encounter with real suffering and responsibility. It awakened something in her. The end of the war coincided with her coming of age, but the defining moment of her liberation, the event that finally swung open the door of the gilded cage, came on the 19th of September, 1921. On that day, her beloved grandfather, Sir Ernest Cassell, died. His death was the end of an era, and for Edwina, it was the beginning of her life. She was 20 years old, and she was now his principal heir. The scale of her inheritance was simply staggering. She received a capital sum of £2 million, the equivalent of well over £100 million in today's money. In addition to this, she inherited the great houses, Brooke House on Park Lane, the country estate of Moulton Paddocks, the seaside villa. Her annual income from trusts was a colossal £30,000 a year, a time when a skilled worker might earn £200. She was now one of the richest, most eligible, and most powerful young women in the world. She was free from her grandfather's controlling influence. Her father, kindly but ineffectual, had little power over her. Society had its expectations, of course, but the sheer scale of her wealth gave her a level of independence that was almost unheard of for a woman of her time. The world was her oyster, and the Roaring Twenties were just getting started. The impeccably raised, emotionally starved, and now staggeringly wealthy Edwina Ashley was about to dive headfirst into the hedonism and chaos of the Jazz Age, ready to make her mark, and to find the love and adventure she had been craving for a lifetime. The cage door was finally open, and she took flight. The Swan was free, and the world that awaited Edwina Ashley was a world reborn, a world desperate to forget the mud and blood of the Great War and dance its trauma away. London in the 1920s was a city of frantic, almost hysterical gaiety. A new generation, haunted by the ghosts of the old, was determined to live for the moment, to burn their candles at both ends. It was an age of cocktails, of jazz, of Freudian psychology, and of a thrilling, if terrifying, collapse of the old social certainties. Into this glittering, chaotic vortex stepped Edwina at 20. She had money to burn, a fierce intelligence, and a thirst for life that never went out. She wasn't just a participant in this new world. She became its queen. She was the brightest of the bright young things, that celebrated group of aristocratic bohemians who treated London as their personal playground. Her wealth allowed her to set the pace. Her parties at Brooke House were legendary. Her clothes were the talk of the town, and her energy was inexhaustible. She spent money with a speed and abandon that was breathtaking even for her wealthy peers. There were shopping sprees in Paris where she would buy dozens of couture gowns at a time. There was a fleet of cars, including a custom-built silver Rolls-Royce. She traveled constantly, thinking nothing of sailing to America for a party or journeying to the French Riviera for a weekend. She danced until dawn, gambled for high stakes, and surrounded herself with a fast-paced, witty, and often reckless crowd. On the surface, it was the pinnacle of glamour. But beneath the hedonism was a desperate, almost frantic search for stimulation. This wasn't just frivolity, it was a rebellion against the cold, restrictive, and emotionally sterile world of her childhood. Every late night, every expensive dress, every cocktail was an act of defiance against the memory of the silent, formal dinners and the lonely nursery. She was trying to fill the emotional void she had carried for so long with noise, with excitement, with sensation. But the void was vast, and no amount of champagne could ever truly fill it. She needed something more. She needed a purpose, a challenge, and she found it in the form of a man who was her equal in ambition, glamour, and royal pedigree. His name was Lord Louis Mountbatten, but to his friends and family he was simply Dickie, and he was, by any measure, the most eligible bachelor in the post-war world. His lineage was impeccable. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a prince of the German House of Battenberg, whose family had anglicized their name during the war. His mother was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, his father a former First Sea Lord. He was a cousin of the reigning king, George V, and a beloved nephew of the last Tsarina of Russia. But he wasn't just a name. He was a man of action, a charismatic and fiercely ambitious officer in the Royal Navy, determined to rise to the very top. He was also, by all accounts, breathtakingly handsome, with a film star smile and an aura of effortless confidence. He was the ultimate prize in the aristocratic marriage market, and he was completely and utterly captivated by the one woman in London who seemed entirely unimpressed by his royal connections, Edwina Ashley. They met in 1920 at a society ball. The attraction was immediate and undeniable. Dickie was smitten. He saw in Edwina not just a great beauty and a great fortune, but a spirit and intelligence that challenged and excited him. He pursued her with the single-minded determination he applied to his naval career. Edwina, for her part, was intrigued. Here was a man who wasn't just after her money. He had his own immense ambition, his own powerful connections. He was a man of substance, not just another foppish aristocrat. Their courtship was a high society sensation, breathlessly followed by the press. In 1921, Dickie was appointed as an aide-de-camp to his cousin, the Prince of Wales, on a royal tour of India. It was there, amidst the pomp and pageantry of the British Raj, that he proposed. He sent a telegram to her father asking for her hand, and Edwina accepted. The news of their engagement created a media frenzy. It was the fairy tale match of the century, the dashing prince's cousin and the beautiful, impossibly wealthy heiress. It seemed a union destined for greatness. Their wedding on the 18th of July, 1922, was the social event of the decade, a spectacle of royal pageantry and public fascination. The ceremony took place at St. Margaret's, Westminster, the unofficial church of the British establishment. The guest list was a roll call of European royalty and aristocracy. The Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, served as Dickie's best man. Thousands of ordinary people lined the streets, a sea of cheering faces desperate for a glimpse of the glamorous couple, a symbol of hope and romance in a world still recovering from the scars of war. Edwina was a vision in a shimmering silver gown by Norman Hartnell, the very picture of a radiant modern bride. The honeymoon was an epic, globe-trotting affair that lasted for months, cementing their status as the world's most glamorous couple. They toured America, where they were feted like Hollywood royalty, socializing with stars like Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks. They journeyed on to Japan, China, and Siam. They were young, beautiful, rich, and in love. The world was at their feet. They returned to England to set up home, first in a lavish London townhouse and later at Adsdean House in Sussex, while beginning work on their forever home, Broadlands, in Hampshire, a magnificent estate inherited from Edwina's father. In 1924, their first daughter, Patricia, was born, followed 5 years later by their second, Pamela, in 1929. On the surface, the fairy tale was complete. The perfect marriage, the beautiful children, the life of unimaginable privilege. But beneath the glittering facade, the very foundations of their relationship were beginning to crack. The very qualities that had drawn them to each other, his discipline, her spontaneity, were now the source of constant friction. Dickie was a man pathologically obsessed with order and precision. His life was run like one of his naval warships. He was meticulous, punctual to the second, and a relentless planner who documented every detail of his existence. He craved control. Edwina was his polar opposite. She was gloriously, maddeningly chaotic. She was perpetually late, hopelessly disorganized with money despite her immense wealth, and lived her life in a whirlwind of spontaneous decisions. She resisted all forms of control, especially his. His naval career demanded frequent and long separations, leaving Edwina alone for months at a time. While he was absorbed in the rigid masculine world of the Navy, she was left to her own devices. And Edwina Ashley did not do well with being left to her own devices. Boredom was her greatest enemy, and she grew profoundly, dangerously bored with the life of a conventional naval wife. Her relationship with motherhood was equally complex. By the standards of her class, she was a loving mother, but she was not a naturally maternal woman. She adored her daughters, but found the day-to-day routine of the nursery and the school run to be utterly stifling. She was often an absent figure, delegating the children's care to a team of nannies and governesses, while she pursued her own restless travels and social life. Her daughter Pamela would later write, with a mixture of love and clear-eyed honesty, that her mother was a will-o'-the-wisp, a dazzling but often distant presence in their lives. The emotional void from Edwina's own childhood was, in some ways, being passed down to the next generation. This growing disillusionment with her life, her marriage, and herself led her to seek excitement, passion, and validation elsewhere. She began to have affairs. This was not particularly unusual in their aristocratic circle, where discreet infidelity was often a quiet feature of married life. But Edwina's affairs were rarely discreet. She pursued them with the same reckless, all-or-nothing energy she applied to everything else. Her lovers were a varied an eclectic group, often men who offered a stark contrast to her rigid establishment husband. There was a long and passionate affair with the handsome polo player, Laddie Sanford. There was the powerful newspaper magnate, Lord Beaverbrook. But the affair that brought her marriage to the brink of total collapse was with Hugh Molyneux, the 7th Earl of Sefton, a charming and titled society figure. This was not a casual fling. It was a serious, intense relationship that consumed her. Dickie was devastated. For all his ambition and worldliness, he was, at his core, a deeply romantic and conventional man when it came to his marriage. He adored Edwina. Her infidelity was a profound, soul-crushing blow, not just to his pride, but to his heart. His letters and diary entries from this period are a painful chronicle of jealousy, despair, and a desperate fear of losing her. He wrote of his dog-like devotion to her and the living hell of his loneliness. The fairy tale had become a nightmare. By 1931, the marriage had reached a breaking point. Divorce seemed inevitable. For Dickie, this was a terrifying prospect. A public, scandalous divorce would be a catastrophe for his naval career, which was the central pillar of his identity. It would also mean losing Edwina, the woman he still, despite everything, loved obsessively. He confronted her. A series of painful, soul-searching conversations took place. They had a choice. They could end their marriage and face the public fallout, or they could find another way, a radical way. They chose the latter. They struck a bargain. A devil's bargain, some might call it, but a bargain that would, in its own strange way, save their partnership. They would remain married. They would continue to present a united front to the world. They would raise their daughters together and function as a public couple, but in private, they would be free. Free to seek love, comfort, and passion wherever they could find it. They agreed to an open marriage, a pact of mutual tolerance for each other's affairs. It was an extraordinary, almost revolutionary solution for a couple at the heart of the British establishment in the 1930s. For Dickie, it was a pragmatic act of self-preservation, a painful compromise to keep his wife and his career. He gradually adapted, eventually embarking on his own long-term affair with a beautiful French socialite named Yola Letellier. But his emotional center of gravity always remained Edwina. He learned to accept her lovers, even in some cases, to befriend them. He created a home at Broadlands where they were often tolerated, if not exactly welcomed. For Edwina, this arrangement was a liberation. It gave her the freedom she had always craved, without the social stigma of a divorce. She was free to pursue her own life, to travel, to love, to search for the connection she felt was missing from her marriage. Yet this freedom was not without its own kind of prison. It locked her into a life of constant, restless searching, a series of passionate but often transient encounters that never seemed to quench her underlying loneliness. It was during this period that the most explosive scandal of her life erupted. Rumors began to circulate of an affair between Edwina and the American singer, actor, and political activist Paul Robeson. Robeson was a titan of the 20th century, a brilliant artist with a magnificent voice and a powerful, charismatic black man who was an outspoken critic of racism and colonialism. The mere suggestion of an intimate relationship between a leading member of the British royal family circle and a radical black American was social dynamite in the deeply racist climate of the 1930s. The rumor was spread by the press, and it became a vicious public scandal. Edwina, furious, did something unprecedented. She sued the newspaper that printed the story for libel, and in a sensational court case, she won. But the victory did little to quell the whispers. To this day, Historians debate whether the affair actually happened. What is undeniable is that Edwina was drawn to Robeson's intellect and charisma, and he to hers. The scandal, whether based in fact or fiction, says everything about her character. Her complete and utter disregard for the racial and social taboos of her era, and her attraction to powerful, brilliant, and dangerous men. And so, the 1930s unfolded for Edwina in a whirl of travel, adventure, and discreet and not so discreet love affairs. Her marriage to Dickie had settled into a complex but functional partnership, a business arrangement with occasional moments of deep affection. She had her freedom, but she still lacked a purpose. She was swimming in many lakes, but she was still, at her core, profoundly adrift. The world, however, was about to provide her with a cause so vast and so terrible that it would eclipse all her personal dramas and finally give her the meaning she had been searching for all her life. The storm clouds of war were gathering, and the restless Swan was about to find her true calling. The 1930s had been a decade of personal chaos for Edwina, a dizzying, globe-trotting search for a happiness that remained tantalizingly out of reach. Her life was a meticulously curated performance of glamour, but it was a performance without a script, a journey without a destination. And then the world caught fire. The declaration of war against Nazi Germany was a cataclysm that would reshape the globe, but for Edwina Mountbatten, it was something more. It was an anchor, a purpose, a sudden, shocking, and ultimately clarifying dose of reality. The frivolous, self-absorbed world of parties, polo matches, and illicit affairs didn't just fade away, it evaporated overnight, rendered obsolete and slightly shameful by the sheer scale of the national crisis. The existential boredom that had plagued Edwina for 2 decades was replaced by a sense of immediate and undeniable urgency. This was the something real she had been subconsciously searching for. The restless energy that she had once poured into redecorating houses and planning trips to exotic locales was now channeled into a single, all-consuming objective: the war effort. Her transformation was as swift as it was absolute. Even before the outbreak of hostilities, she had been involved with the St. John Ambulance Brigade, a voluntary first aid and nursing organization. It had been, up to that point, a respectable and not too demanding occupation for a lady of her standing. But now, she seized upon it with a ferocious intensity. She wasn't content to be a mere figurehead or a patron. She wanted to be in the thick of it. Drawing on her considerable intelligence and natural authority, she rose rapidly through the ranks, becoming the superintendent-in-chief of the entire organization. And as the phony war gave way to the terrifying reality of the Blitz in 1940, with London burning under a nightly deluge of German bombs, Edwina found her true calling, not in a palace ballroom, but in the dust, chaos, and terror of the city's bomb shelters and makeshift hospitals. The image of the couture-clad society hostess was replaced by a new, more powerful one. Edwina in the simple, dark uniform of the St. John Ambulance Brigade, her face smudged with soot, her expression one of fierce determination. This was not a photo opportunity. It was her daily reality. She worked tirelessly, often around the clock, her days a relentless blur of inspections, meetings, and emergency calls. She became a familiar sight in the most heavily bombed areas of London, particularly the working-class East End, which bore the brunt of the Luftwaffe's assault. She would arrive in the aftermath of a raid, her official car picking its way through rubble-strewn streets, and immediately take charge. She had an almost supernatural ability to cut through the fog of war and the quagmire of bureaucracy. She used her name and her imperious aristocratic bearing, the very qualities that could make her so infuriating in private life, as a weapon for good. A cowering local official who might ignore a plea from a nurse would snap to attention when confronted by the formidable Lady Lewis Mountbatten, demanding to know why a shipment of blankets had not arrived or why a particular shelter lacked basic medical supplies. There are countless anecdotes of her effectiveness. She once found a shelter where the bunks were infested with lice, and after her complaints were ignored, she took one of the lice-ridden blankets, wrapped it in brown paper, and had it delivered to the desk of the responsible government minister with her compliments. The problem was rectified within hours. She was, as one exhausted colleague described her, a human dynamo, a whirlwind of organized, purposeful, and often terrifying energy. This work exposed her for the first time in her insulated life to the raw reality of human suffering. She wasn't just inspecting facilities. She was holding the hands of the dying, comforting, terrified children, and talking to families who had lost everything in a single night. The spoiled heiress who had once cried with frustration over a misplaced piece of luggage was now witnessing unimaginable loss with a courage and compassion that stunned those around her. The experience didn't break her. It forged her. It burned away the trivialities and left behind a core of tempered steel. Her husband, Dickie, now a key figure in combined operations, watched her transformation with a sense of profound awe. The restless, unpredictable woman who had caused him so much pain was now a national figure of strength and dedication. Their marriage, founded on a fragile and painful bargain, began to find a new, deeper foundation. The shared danger and common purpose of the war created a bond of mutual respect and admiration that had often been absent in peacetime. They were no longer just a glamorous couple. They were a partnership, a true power couple working towards a common goal. But Edwina's work was not confined to the home front. In 1943, her world and the scope of her mission expanded dramatically. Dickie was given one of the most important and challenging commands of the war. He was appointed Supreme Allied Commander of the newly formed Southeast Asia Command, or SEAC. His task was to lead the fight against the Japanese in the vast and difficult theater of Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. And Edwina, refusing to be left behind, insisted on joining him, not as a commander's wife, but as a worker with a mission of her own. Representing the St. John Ambulance Brigade and the Red Cross, Edwina embarked on a grueling and perilous tour of the Southeast Asia Command. Her official purpose was to investigate and report on the welfare of the troops, both Allied and Commonwealth, and to assess the state of military hospitals and medical facilities. It was a journey that would take her to the very heart of the war in the East, and it would expose her to a level of suffering that would dwarf even the horrors of the Blitz. This was no comfortable VIP tour. She traveled in Spartan conditions, flying thousands of miles in unpressurized, freezing cold military aircraft, and covering vast distances on the ground in jeeps that churned through mud-choked jungle tracks. She was constantly on the move, from the vast military bases in India to the forward area field hospitals in the jungles of Burma, often just miles behind the front lines. What she discovered appalled her. She found hospitals rife with disease, desperately short of basic supplies like quinine and bandages. She saw men suffering not just from terrible wounds, but from the ravages of malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases. She saw a military medical system that was often overwhelmed, under-resourced, and crippled by the kind of bureaucratic inertia she despised, and she reacted with characteristic fury. She was a whirlwind of righteous anger, a one-woman inspection team who left a trail of terrified, chastened, and ultimately motivated commanding officers in her wake. She documented every failing, every shortage, every lapse in care. She used her unique position as the wife of the Supreme Commander to bypass the usual channels and take her complaints straight to the top. She became the soldiers' greatest champion, fighting for them with a tenacity that earned her their undying gratitude and the eternal exasperation of the military brass. A famous story tells of her visiting a hospital and demanding to see the medical supply stores, only to be told they were locked and the quartermaster had the key. "Get me a hatchet," she commanded, and stood there, ready to break the door down herself, until the terrified officer found the key. This journey was a profound education. It deepened her understanding of the human cost of war and solidified her sense of purpose. But it also gave her her first real, immersive experience of the Indian subcontinent, a place that would come to define the final and most significant chapter of her life. She saw its beauty, its poverty, and its immense complexity, and she forged a deep and immediate connection with its people. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but for the Mountbattens the fight was not over. The war against Japan raged on. When VJ Day finally came in August 1945, after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Edwina was one of the first Allied women to enter the newly liberated city of Singapore, and it was there that she faced her most harrowing task yet. She went directly to the notorious Japanese prisoner of war camps, like the infamous Changi prison. For years, thousands of Allied soldiers and civilians had been held in these camps in the most brutal and inhuman conditions imaginable. What Edwina found there was a vision of hell. She walked through wards filled with men who were little more than living skeletons, their bodies ravaged by starvation, torture, and untreated diseases. The stench of death and gangrene was overwhelming. Many people would have recoiled in horror. Edwina walked directly into the heart of it. For weeks, she worked tirelessly alongside the exhausted medical staff, helping to care for the sick and the dying. Her brand of compassion was not soft or sentimental. It was fiercely practical. She wasn't there to weep. She was there to work. She organized evacuations, sourced precious medical supplies, and wrote countless letters home on behalf of men who were too weak to hold a pen. But most importantly, she brought them a touch of humanity. She sat with the men, she talked to them, she listened to their stories. She was a symbol of the home they had been fighting for, a sign that their ordeal was finally over. The men who survived would never forget her. By the end of the war, Edwina Mountbatten was utterly transformed. The restless, self-absorbed socialite was gone forever, burned away in the crucible of conflict. In her place was a seasoned, tough, and deeply compassionate humanitarian, a formidable public figure in her own right. She had earned the respect of generals, the admiration of prime ministers, and the love of ordinary soldiers. She and Dickie returned to England as heroes. He was celebrated for his military victory in Burma. She was hailed for her tireless humanitarian work. They were at the absolute zenith of their fame and influence. A return to a quiet life of country weekends and society dinners seemed to be on the cards. But history had one last monumental task for them. In late 1946, the new Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, was facing a crisis. The demand for Indian independence had become an unstoppable torrent. The country was on the brink of civil war, with escalating violence between the Hindu and Muslim communities. The current viceroy was making no progress. Attlee needed a new man, someone with immense prestige, royal connections, and a touch of the maverick. He needed a man who could get the job done and get it done quickly. He sent for Dickie Mountbatten. The offer was the greatest challenge of Dickie's life. to go to India as the 20th and final Viceroy. His mission was to end 300 years of British rule, to oversee the transfer of power, and to get out, all within the space of a little over a year. It was a task fraught with danger, a poisoned chalice that had the potential to destroy his reputation forever. He hesitated. It was Edwina, the woman who had found her own soul in India, who urged him to accept. She knew with a certainty that surprised even herself that their destiny lay there. And so, in March 1947, they prepared to sail for India one last time. Edwina had been forged into an expert administrator and a world-renowned humanitarian by the fires of war. She was no longer the restless Swan, swimming in circles in the shallow lakes of high society. She was a woman with a profound sense of purpose, ready to face the greatest challenge of her life. She was about to step onto the stage of world history, and in the heart of the collapsing British Raj, she was about to find the great, defining, and most controversial love of her life. In March 1947, as the English spring began to bloom, Lord and Lady Edwina Mountbatten arrived in an India that was on the verge of a volcanic eruption. The subcontinent was a powder keg of hope, of rage, of centuries of simmering resentments and fervent nationalist dreams. The demand for independence, so long resisted, had become an unstoppable force. But the question was no longer if Britain would leave, but how. The great unifying dream of a single independent India was fracturing along ancient and bloody fault lines, primarily between the Hindu-dominated Congress Party and the Muslim League, which was now demanding a separate nation of its own, Pakistan. Into this maelstrom of political intrigue and rising communal violence stepped the Mountbattens. Dickie was the 20th and final Viceroy, the man charged with the monumental, near-impossible task of ending 3 centuries of British rule with dignity and, hopefully, without plunging the nation of 400 million people into a catastrophic civil war. And at his side was Edwina, the last Vicereine, a woman who was about to undertake the most significant and challenging role of her life. From the moment they arrived, it was clear that this would be a viceroyalty unlike any other. The Mountbattens, particularly Edwina, systematically began to dismantle the stuffy, racially segregated, and suffocatingly formal protocols of the Raj. The Viceroy's house, that great symbol of imperial dominance, had for decades been a place where Indians, even high-ranking princes and politicians, were treated as second-class citizens, often made to use side entrances. Edwina threw the doors open. She ordered that the velvet ropes cordoning off the staterooms be taken down. She insisted that Indian staff be treated with a new level of respect and familiarity. And she filled the guest lists for dinners and receptions with Indian artists, writers, and political leaders, not just the usual parade of British officials and compliant Maharajas. Her approach was a shock to the system. It was warm, informal, and utterly genuine. She radiated an energy and an empathy that completely disarmed people. While Dickie plunged into the marathon, high-stakes political negotiations with the party leaders, Edwina embarked on her own campaign to win the hearts and minds of the Indian people. She visited villages, hospitals, and women's groups, listening to their concerns with a sincerity that was totally alien to the distant, condescending attitude of her predecessors. She was not playing a role. She was deploying the full force of her personality and the hard-won lessons of her wartime work to build bridges of trust and affection. But the most important bridge she would build was with one man, a man who held the destiny of India in his hands. His name was Jawaharlal Nehru. He was the leader of the Congress Party, the political heir to Mahatma Gandhi, and the man who was destined to become the first prime minister of a free India. Nehru was a towering figure of the 20th century, a brilliant intellectual, educated at Harrow and Cambridge, a powerful orator, and a visionary statesman who had spent years in British prisons for his role in the independence movement. He was also a lonely man. A widower for over a decade, he was isolated by the immense burdens of his position, a man of deep sensitivity and passion who had sublimated his personal life for the cause of his nation. From their very first meeting, the connection between Edwina and Nehru was immediate, profound, and electric. It was, by all accounts, a meeting of souls. Here, in this 50-year-old English aristocrat, Nehru found a woman who could match his intellect, understand the crushing weight of his responsibilities, and speak to the lonely poet within the statesman. And in this brilliant, charismatic Indian leader, Edwina found everything she had been searching for her entire life. A man of immense purpose, a mind that challenged and stimulated her own, and a deep, unconditional emotional and spiritual connection that her marriage, for all its complexities, had never provided. Their relationship blossomed with astonishing speed. They quickly became inseparable, spending hours in deep conversation, finding in each other a sanctuary from the relentless pressures of the world. It was undoubtedly a deep and passionate love affair, but to define it merely in physical terms is to diminish its significance. It was a profound meeting of minds. They wrote to each other constantly, sometimes multiple times a day. Their letters, many of which have since been published, are a remarkable testament to the depth of their feelings. They are not the letters of frivolous lovers, but of two people sharing the innermost workings of their hearts and minds, discussing politics, philosophy, poetry, and their shared dreams for India's future. Nehru, a man not given to easy sentiment, wrote to her of this uncontrollable force that drew them together, a feeling that was deeper than sex. For him, she was a source of strength and solace at the most critical moment in his nation's history. For her, he was the destination at the end of her long, restless journey. She had finally found her intellectual and emotional home. And what of Dickie Mountbatten? Far from being the blind or wronged husband, he was the third and essential member of this extraordinary trio. He not only knew about the relationship, but in his own way, he encouraged it. He recognized the profound, non-negotiable nature of the bond between his wife and Nehru. He also, with his astute political mind, understood its immense value. At a time when negotiations were fraught with suspicion and paranoia, the genuine love between his wife and the future prime minister created a channel of absolute trust, an unbreakable link that allowed them to work together with a frankness and intimacy that would have otherwise been impossible. His own daughter Pamela would later write with stunning insight that her mother's relationship with Nehru was the affair that completed the triangle. The three of them were so interdependent. This unique and powerful bond would be tested to its absolute limit in the terrible months to come. The political dream of a united independent India was dying. The intransigence of the Muslim League leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the escalating communal violence made it clear that a single state was no longer viable. With a heavy heart, and under immense pressure from London to expedite the transfer of power, Mountbatten made the fateful decision. The British Raj would be partitioned into two separate independent nations, a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan. And the date for independence was brought forward with shocking abruptness to the 15th of August, 1947. The Partition of India was a human catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale. The drawing of a line on a map by a British lawyer, who had never before set foot in India, uprooted more than 14 million people, triggering the largest mass migration in human history. It unleashed a firestorm of sectarian hatred and violence. Hindus and Sikhs trapped in the new Pakistan and Muslims trapped in India were set upon by armed mobs. Entire villages were massacred. Trains arrived at their destinations filled with the silent, butchered bodies of their passengers. The scale of the slaughter was apocalyptic. Historians estimate that between 200,000 and 2 million people were killed in a matter of months. In the midst of this man-made hell, Edwina Mountbatten performed her finest and most heroic work. The title of Vicereine now meant nothing. She shed the last vestiges of her ceremonial role, and with the practical hands-on courage she had learned in the Blitz, she plunged directly into the heart of the suffering. She abandoned the safety and luxury of the Viceroy's house to tour the makeshift cholera-ridden refugee camps that had sprung up across the Punjab, the epicenter of the violence. The sights, sounds, and smells were an assault on the senses. But Edwina, who had walked through the horrors of liberated POW camps, did not flinch. She became a one-woman relief agency. She organized convoys of medical supplies. She set up field hospitals. She procured food and blankets. But it was her personal courage that became the stuff of legend. She was utterly fearless. She would walk into the middle of riot-torn villages, her presence so commanding and her moral authority so absolute that she could shame armed mobs into laying down their weapons. There is a famous account of her arriving at a camp where thousands of sick and dying Sikh refugees were being housed. The camp was surrounded by a hostile Muslim crowd. She climbed onto the bonnet of her jeep and spoke to the mob, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned them into silence, and then shamed them into helping her distribute aid. The Indian people who witnessed her work gave her a new title. They called her an angel of mercy, a goddess. She had become a symbol of hope and compassion in a world consumed by hatred. This work was the absolute culmination of her life's journey. The restless energy, the imperious nature, the administrative genius, the deep well of empathy that had lain dormant for so long, it all came together in the service of this great human crisis. The spoiled, self-absorbed heiress was now risking her life daily to save people who had nothing. It was the hardest, most harrowing work she had ever done, and it was the most meaningful. In June 1948, after 15 tumultuous months, the Mountbattens' mission was over. They departed from an India that was now free, but also deeply scarred. The farewell was extraordinary. The formal, stiff protocol of the Raj was replaced by a vast emotional outpouring of genuine affection from the Indian people. They had come as representatives of an imperial power, but they left as beloved friends. And for Edwina, it was the leaving of a place that had become her spiritual home, and the leaving of the man who had become the love of her life. Her relationship with Nehru did not end. It transformed into one of the great long-distance love stories of the 20th century. They wrote to each other every week, their letters a continuous conversation that spanned the remaining years of her life. She returned to India often, not as a former Vicereine, but as a cherished guest of the Prime Minister, a woman who was welcomed in his home as family. Edwina never returned to the frivolous life she had once led. The work had changed her irrevocably. She dedicated the rest of her days to her humanitarian causes, principally the St. John Ambulance Brigade. She became a global ambassador for public health, traveling relentlessly, inspecting hospitals and nursing stations in the remotest corners of the Commonwealth. The pace she set was punishing, as if she was terrified of stopping, terrified of the silence that might descend if the work ever ended. This frantic activity took a heavy toll on her health. Her friends and family begged her to slow down, but she refused. In February 1960, while on an exhausting tour of inspection for St. John in British North Borneo, her heart, so often described as restless, finally gave out. She was found one morning to have died peacefully in her sleep. She was just 58 years old. By her bedside was her most recent batch of letters. They were from Nehru. Her death prompted an outpouring of grief from around the world. In Britain, in a final tribute to her service and her husband's naval career, she was granted a burial at sea from the frigate HMS Wakeful. As her coffin, draped in the Union Jack, slid into the English Channel, the Indian government paid its own, deeply personal tribute. Nehru, heartbroken, had dispatched an Indian naval frigate, the INS Trishul, to shadow the Royal Navy vessel. As Edwina's body was committed to the waves, the Indian sailors cast a wreath of marigolds, the traditional flower of India, into the sea. It was a final poignant farewell from a man and a nation that had loved her. Edwina Mountbatten was indeed a royal swan, born to glide on the most exclusive and glittering of lakes. But her spirit, her restless heart, refused to be confined to a single placid body of water. She swam in the glamorous, champagne-filled lakes of high society. She plunged into the turbulent, forbidden lakes of illicit passion. And finally, she immersed herself in the deep, sorrowful, and profound lakes of human suffering. And it was there, in those muddy, troubled waters, that she finally and truly found herself. Her life is one of the great stories of transformation in the 20th century. It is the story of how a spoiled, directionless, and often selfish heiress became one of her generation's great humanitarians. It is a life that challenges our easy judgments, reminding us of the profound complexity of the human heart and its infinite capacity for change. She was a flawed woman, a product of immense privilege, but she was also a woman who learned to wield that privilege not as a weapon of entitlement, but as a tool for compassion. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.